Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Good to be here again, Arnie.
No worries. Pleased to have you, Robert. Always pleased to have you. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Good to see you again, Arnie.
No worries. All right,
Let's tackle it.
let's tackle it. That's right. Today's subject, creative destruction 2. A continuation of creative destruction the other week. I'm going to cut across to a website here and social credit views employment induced pollution, written by Edward Minton. Edward Minton, yes, it is. Employment induced pollution. And it's within that article is an interesting argument. The argument that with advancement in technology to the point where one man with machine aid and technology, the increment of association, the cultural inheritance, can produce what 1,000 men used to produce. This is the type of ratio that we're looking at. And so when we talk about full employment as if you like, as a policy, it's a form of insanity because the article argues what we end up doing is turning the entire world into a giant productive slag heap. We don't actually be we are not actually environmentally responsible. We're not producing as we need it, but rather we're attempting falsely to balance our financial books. It's an entirely false narrative. And so we overproduce. And of course, if you like, the greatest representation of overproduction is the war machine. The war machine. And of course, I mentioned in this coming week's On Target the demonstration of power of, if you like, the communist blocs is always to do with military might. It's always to do with the, if you like, look what we can produce, these giant intercontinental ballistic missiles, these tanks, these ships, these aircraft, new weaponry. It's all about power, whether it's a threat to other countries or it's a threat to their very own people. It's essentially the administration is exercising or demonstrating the level of destructive power that is at their hands. Whereas, if we look at industry and we look at its efficiency, this is why this argument is most important, this article. If we look at industry, we look at efficiency, we realise that, hang on, we've got an entirely new and unprecedented narrative. And the narrative is one of plenty, one of, if you like, the capacity to produce more than enough. Therefore, if the 999 people who are not required to produce what was sufficient several hundred years ago, if they're not required, then there has to be a method where they have access to the abundance, access to this plenty. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, this is something that has been observed by intelligent people for quite some time. I remember that Winston Churchill gave a Romanes lecture in 1930, and he said that we were living in a strange time because there was obviously plenty of everything, and yet there was continuing poverty. So he was able to make that observation. Now, in his political career, he didn't seem to do anything to remedying the situation. So he was able to discern it, but I think he was under some control by financial interests, and it's not in their interest to admit the general population to abundance, because if you do that, you spread freedom, because people who have the means of living well without any coercion on them are obviously able to tell people who'd like to dictate to them to go fly a kite. This is not what our rulers want us to be able to do. So that is a problem we have. The desire to maintain control over people leads to tremendous productive inefficiency. It's way of diverting people from what they could be doing most efficiently because they are naturally attracted to the activity. I think psychologists generally recommend, now nobody's working anymore, but when people were working, they used to estimate that about 85% of people weren't really satisfied with what they were doing in order to earn incomes. So this has got, it's a thing that undermines a healthy psychology, and inevitably results in inefficiencies being generated. It's just something that we've had to contend with, because the financial system must work in order to obtain income. It's a strange axiom to begin with, to start from, because the idea surely is that we should work in order to provide ourselves with what we need in order to live well. But this notion that we work in order to earn income has been interposed between the sane position that we work in order to give ourselves the good things of life. The money entitles us to what we regard as the good things of life, but it's a secondary consideration. The financial interests have made it the primary consideration, and in doing so, they've made us all slaves of an employment system that compromises our principles and constantly undermines our pure purpose in life.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's an interesting take on it. In Australia, we recently had, just last week, a university professor has been silenced, essentially, by the Vice-Chancellor, by the university, based on his scientific observations, and he's been silenced. In essence, he said, look, we've got to look at the science, we've got to look at the facts, and then base our observations and our comments on that. And of course, it was argued against him. I might point out successfully in the Court of Appeal, argued against him that his attitude was anti-collegiate. I think that's the word. You essentially weren't part of this whole narrative. And so I find that interesting that you point out compromised opinion. It's not based on fact, it's not based on science, it's based on employment prospects and job security. So it's essentially, what is it? Would you call it fascism? I would call it fascism. It's essentially corporate dictatorship, that an employer can actually exercise such power over an individual that they can't even exercise their freedom of thought without jeopardizing their employment, their future security, the security of their family, all these sorts of things. It's a form of bribery or blackmail, in my view. I certainly never worked under that narrative in my 35 years of in the oil and gas. It was changing in the end. I resisted it to the very end, and at one stage I did have to leave a company because I didn't like what was going on, but that was not the end of the world. I actually grew from the situation and continued to exercise my free thought and my opinion. Not so that I was dogmatic and uncomfortable to be around, but simply that I could reason my thinking before my peers and before my management. I could reason my thinking, and they actually encouraged it. So I was in a healthy environment. But to the point where you can't discuss things, you can't consider things, and you certainly can't consider scientific substantiation of something, that really is such a strange environment. It's dictatorial, and I call it corporate fascism. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
So in making a rational argument, this professor is branded as being non-collegial. What sophistry, what absolute hypocrisy. This is pure Phariseeism. It is just absolute hypocrisy. If they think up a new term every week, and when I say they, I mean the communist-oriented element that runs this general dispensation, you must remember that society is metaphysical, and whoever has control of the metaphysics will have control of society. And this is just what they call a man, or something which is introduced and to which you have been conditioned to respond in a trained and predictable manner. It is a diabolical form of people control, where the individual does not really think individually at all. He thinks it's groupthink. And groups don't think. They can be shoved around, they can be pressured, they can be forced into certain activities, into slavish activities. But this is all psychological. And if we don't get, I mean, if someone to come to you and say, look, I'm starting up a new business, and my new business is going to be really progressive. We're going to create jobs. And you ask me for my money to invest in your business, I think I'm going to ask some questions. So in other words, you're producing a business to create jobs. How about goods and services in plenitude that might result in leisure? So in other words, you're telling me that in order to be inefficient, you want my assistance with my resources, with my savings, with my investment. You know, it's so insane that it just doesn't, for the rational mind, it just simply is totally debilitating. But you see, it's all based on metaphysics. And this is the metaphysics of guilt. We are all told that there isn't enough for us to possess in order to have a decent life unless we're working. And the more of us are working, and the more time we're spent working, the freer we're going to be. Well, when does that freedom kick in and take place? Because you're always told that you must work harder and harder. So hard that you were even enlisted into the destruction of continents through a war. And then the whole thing is given a moral aspect by institutionalized glorification of this type of destruction and glorification of the marvelous sacrificial contributions of those who have been sacrificed. It's really a very strange world we live in. But it's not strange if you realize that it is run by people who want to control the rest of society, because that's exactly what they would be recommending. So you see, we have been enslaved, and we don't know it. We think that the only way to escape it is to become more enslaved. Truly, we are quite mad.
Thank you for that, Wally. That's a profound observation, and it's jolting, it's jarring actually to start thinking that this whole, if you like, this current civilization is insane. We look at that article. It looks at the productive capacity as having increased 1,000-fold for what one man and machines can do, as to what a man could do several hundred years ago, increasing 1,000-fold. Where is the point where it says, well, one man's doing it, the other 999 can take the day off, they can take the year off. This bloke is particularly good. He can not only enjoy the fruits of his labour, but he can also be paid in a commensurate, I think, amount that is a reward for him for managing the machine so well. But the other 999, they need access. They need access to the fruits of production. And there's nothing out there. There's nothing out there. And yet it's a time of abundance. The farmers can produce more than enough food. The manufacturers can produce more than enough, to the point where large economies are generating perhaps 25% of their manufacturing base to weaponry. Totally unnecessary. Totally unnecessary. We need to beat the swords and the spears back into plowshares. That's what we need to do. We need to actually look at it and say, okay, there's nothing wrong with having a defensive attitude. There's nothing wrong with that. But an offensive attitude, always ready for war, what is the great threat? The great threat is that you can't get the markets that you need in order to balance the books. So the threat is one of administration. It's one of the methods of the system of administration. We don't need to expand competing markets overseas. We don't need to. We should be able to satisfy ourselves within with our own borders, and producing enough, and then having a time of leisure. That is this time. That is this age. That is this era. And it's as if we are terrified to open and walk through this door. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, exactly, Arnie. If you took the military element out of the American economy, I don't think there would be much left. And what is it all about? It's all about preparing for some future eventuality. And the idea that is constantly suggested to us is that if we sacrifice today, things will be better in the future. This is the appeal that has always been made to populations that fall under communist control. We'll have a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan, and after 5 years or 10 years, things will get better, and you'll actually have only 3 people in your per room in an apartment, and you might actually have running water because the future will be bright. But the potential for that future is with us now. The knowledge about how to provide this material well-being is there, and the physical means of providing it are always there. So the government is constantly saying, if you sacrifice today, then you can expect that things will be better in the future. But when that future comes, they always come up with another excuse for sacrificing more. And then they come up with the financial argument that we have a huge financial deficit, and therefore for a period we have to introduce austerity. Well, there's no necessity for the austerity in real terms. The physical assets are there, and the know-how is there, and the manpower is there to deliver all these things. But we're constantly being told we can't have them today, we can only have them in the future. And a good recent example of this is what's been going on with this COVID thing, because they've been denying people normal health care because they say they have to preserve the healthcare systems. So they say the healthcare system must be relieved of its normal responsibilities so that in the future we will still have one. It's another telling people that they must sacrifice in order to keep something for the future. It's just unending. And they will never say, we're really quite well off and we could all be living a comfortable life and we don't have to sacrifice because the sacrifices have been made in the past. So now we can actually enjoy the benefits of them. They constantly come up with a new excuse for imposing hardship on the population. And now with this COVID, we've reached a new level of hardship. I really fear for how desperate it's going to become in the months ahead, because we've felt some of the effects, but they're not letting it go. We've been told by the highest authorities, the World Health Organization, Bill Gates, all these people who seem to be controlling policy, that nothing will change for at least a year and a half or 2 years. Well, we were supposed to be going into some kind of controls for 2 weeks when this thing started, but you can see it was just a trap. And again, we have to look to the future. We have to sacrifice today. We have to sacrifice our friendships, our associations, our freedom of movement, our ability to take care of our loved ones in care homes. That is absolutely brutal. And it's really incomprehensible that people stand for it. But it's always, if we give up something today, then we will get the benefit in the future. But it's a completely contrived and concocted argument, because there's no necessity for us to sacrifice these things today. All the means of a good life are there.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's well put. I'll remind our viewers that we've had several threats, at least in the last 20 years. One of them was the Y2K, that all the planes were going to fall out of the sky and industry was going to shut down, and we had to head in this direction like a herd of sheep. And then it was, of course, mad cow disease. It was the war on terror, SARS, and now COVID. Of course, climate, bushfires in Australia, climate. I point out some of the observable things that I take from these threats, these scaremongering done by the mainstream media, which is really propaganda wing for big business, for big money, is that the economy for the world has been shut down these last 4 months. It's been shut down. Don't think it hasn't. It has. Industry, you can't leave your home. You're working remotely. Huge manufacturing has stopped. People are hoarding toilet paper. And the thing is that it's just, you consider all of this sort of fear-mongering that's gone on, and yet, the level of CO2 in the environment is continuing to climb at the same rate. CO2. Now, CO2 was supposed to be the cause of global warming. We had to shut down the economy, especially the West, in order to protect the environment. But CO2 is continuing to climb with the West shut down. It's a false narrative, an entirely false narrative, and we really have to put this in perspective. I've actually I remembered another one, and that was the ozone layer. Now remember chlorofluorocarbons? We had the propellants that were in spray cans or certain types of products, whatever. We had to actually take them out. We went through this entire thing that was directed from the United Nations to take it out because of the hole in the ozone layer, and it was going to affect us so drastically. And yet now there's no talk of it, because they've found that argument was a spurious argument, that the ozone layer does change. It changes every year, and it's got to do with the radiation, if you like, the sunspots, the radiation blasts that come from the sun. It's an actual phenomena that the Earth has been experienced since the Earth began, and it hasn't changed. It's just that this phenomena was argued in order to control the market. It was there for the benefit of big business, this whole spurious thing. It goes on and it goes on and it goes on. Propaganda, COVID-19, climate, propaganda, ozone, propaganda, war on terror, propaganda, invading countries that were not threatening the West at all, invading them, and this sort of thing. We go through this analysis, and we've got to demesmerize and recognize. We've got to actually jolt ourselves into start thinking. It's not straightforward. This is going to take effort, but the fact is that's what it is. We're either a herd of sheep that's just being directed over the cliff, or we're individuals created in the image of God, capable of thinking, capable of being creative, and it's our, if you like, it's our modus operandi. What is the nature of man? It's to be creative. If given every opportunity, that's what mankind does. Whether it's mum or dad baking a cake, or working in the garden and putting veggies in, or planting roses, or building a house, or a newfangled frying machine, whatever it is. Man wants to be creative. And this whole thing has been shut down based on fear. fear as a debilitating force. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, Ernie, you know, Arnie, we are supposed to be condemned to eternal toil. That is our fate because of the so-called inherent evil in mankind, and that is our punishment. But I have a feeling that there are some rather earthly forces that benefit hugely from policies which are implemented as a result of this punitive attitude. I think what you're suggesting is that we should stop being sheep and start thinking like human beings. So couldn't be better advice, because we're not acting rashly. We are responding to stimuli which are artificial and which are artificially and malevolently created in order to control our thinking processes and consequently our activity. So it's a very clever thing they've done. They have managed to get human compliance without the necessity of the fascist jackboot or the communist commissar, just by planting suggestions in our mind. And it is really frightening. It's to visualize, to see, to observe the degree to which a large section of humanity can be really shoved around and controlled that way. Now, somehow we have to free ourselves from that tyranny of the mind. We've got to release ourselves and think constructively, objectively, genuinely scientifically, not pseudoscience, and release ourselves from the whole slavery that's been imposed upon us by this psychological trick that's been played. But of course, when you get control of the media, you're in a position to do that if you have a monopoly of the media, because in order for people to think constructively, they have to be free to observe and think about alternatives. And if you're denied alternatives, you're denied the ability to think except in a prescribed manner, you're debilitated as a human being. And not only that, but your whole civilization is debilitated. It's being destroyed. It's being destroyed by deception. Mm. Now, this is a frightening thing, and I don't know what we're going to do to get out of it, but we're going to have a rebellion of the mind so that we no longer think reflectively or reactively and act reactively according to some ideas which are planted in our minds. Now, of course, they're using this idea now that people who are objecting to the restrictions of some of the restrictions of activity because of the alleged virus, that people like that are selfish because they're not taking into consideration the threat that the virus is alleged to present to society and the threat that they, in fact, are by their unwillingness to just jump at every suggestion that comes from officialdom. An officialdom which, to a large extent, is not qualified anyway. These ideas are not originating with the average administrator. They're originating from above, and they're being imposed upon the administrator. And I have run into professional people say, I've said, yes, people like to eat. And they say, yeah, we need to have our incomes. Mm-hmm. They admit it. Mm-hmm. But they say, what are you going to do about it? Mm-hmm. So we have a very clever psychological strategy that has been used to enslave us. And the thing of it is, it comes about by because of a defect in the price system where we create prices more rapidly than incomes. because we have to bring in costs from the past, which are overheads and which are counted into prices, but they're not distributed in wages, salaries, and dividends. So we have to rely more and more upon a second factor intervening, and that is debt, which is obtained through loans from the banks. In other words, we've been enslaved by debt, and to compound it by the charges of interest that are made on account of the debt. The primary problem is the overheads and the charging of unmonetized costs into prices. The interest results from the shortage of purchasing power that this brings about, because if you are the only source of money, then you're in a position to demand or command a greater price for that commodity. But if the commodity isn't even needed, it's a fraud.
That's right.
It's legalized counterfeiting.
Mm-hmm. And I might say just on that, Wally, that I see it as it's not a commodity, but rather it's a service similar to accounting. And the purpose of, if you like, the financial system is to count accurately, be a reflection, similar to weights and measures. And none of this comes into it. Weights and measures doesn't come into it. Production and consumption is a identifiable measure. This is what we produce. How much do we consume? In order to consume, we have to have a distribution system. That's what the money system is about. It's inadequate. It doesn't achieve its purpose. And I think that in itself is really, really important. Now, I want to just touch on something here and lead Robert into it. And that is that Sigmund Freud, a master of psychology, and of course you've got Pavlov and his dogs and how he developed that science of manipulating people by stimulus, doing it to dogs and then people. And of course Edward Bernays, the American, who happened to be, I think, a great nephew of Sigmund Freud, he drew it to a fine art with marketing and advertising and, of course, people manipulation. And I might point out, Robert, you highlighted the other day that a CEO of Netflix, original CEO, was the great nephew of Bernays. So the idea of people manipulation is not new. It's not unprecedented. In fact, there are masters or scientists at work in order to achieve. Death cults are the same type of, if you like, paranormal experience. They're essentially metaphysical. They enslave people mentally, where they are incapable of freeing themselves from this sort of bondage. And that's where we are psychologically. It's not only the debt, the irredeemable debt, which Wally referred to, highlighting in the price system, but it's this psychological bondage where we don't have the will to free ourselves. And that, to me, is this critical moment in history that we do. We have to emancipate ourselves. We have to emancipate our minds. I'm just going to cut across here and then I'll give you the floor, Robert. Cutting across to our website, alor.org. In here, we've got the Actionist Corner. We've got our libraries, podcast libraries, video libraries, PDF and social credit libraries. The videos are there. The podcasts are there. Our journal, dissemination of the news, done each week to try and demesmerize people, to try and show them. This article by Butler, 1989, I think it was, Releasing Reality, demesmerizing people so that they can actually see the wood for the trees. They can see it. That's the purpose of what we're trying to do, is to try and demesmerize you so that you can actually see. You can see clearly and offer a solution, a way out. Redeem debt, and free you and your mind. But it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen if you're glued, whether it's to the TV or it's to these internet channels. These people are experts at manipulation. And I'll touch on something that I just saw just on the weekend. I was going through different movies, and each of the three movies had the same, if you like, gratuitous violence in it. Gratuitous violence. It was shocking. It was, what the dickens are they doing? And there were 3 separate areas of searching, but they had the same sort of deep, what was it? It was numbing. The violence was so graphic. And in seeing that, I thought, this is part of a plan. This is part of design. This isn't just random. We're going to do 3 searches and we find this gratuitous violence. Totally different search, even different search engines, and it was the same result. So there's something going on, and there's certainly a lot of manipulation, and your mind is being controlled, and you need to demesmerize it. You need to actually take your TV to the balcony, find a balcony, you can borrow mine, and throw it off, and start to release your mind, release reality, observe the natural world. It is one of abundance. The gardens are growing. The rain is coming. The sunshine is there. The fruit is on the trees. The industry is there. The technology is there to remove slavery from us. What isn't happening is the debt system is not redeemable. It's irredeemable. We can't borrow our way out of debt. And that's what's going on with this COVID lockdown. We're borrowing and borrowing and borrowing more. We will never get out of debt, and that is its purpose. That is the design behind this narrative. Your thoughts, please, and believe it or not, closing comments. Robert Klinck.
Well, you mentioned Edward Bernays, and he must have had great fun because he spent his whole life in persuading people to change their habits. He had a great campaign to introduce smoking to women, and he got a large percentage of the female population smoking as a result of this. He introduced the idea that bacon and eggs was the normal American breakfast, and so it became under his influence. It's very interesting, too, that in the Second World War, he was in charge of the campaign to raise money through war bonds. So this is all psychological control of the population. And the problem is that most people are completely passive in the face of this. They do not realize that they are under continuous assault from these mind manipulators. So it's essential that people become aware of this. TV, I'm told, if you regard it passively, puts your mind into some kind of an alpha state where you're completely receptive. You have no more judgment or initiative. And I've observed this in myself. I remember when I was young, I was the one in the family who was the first. We have 5 boys, and I was the one who ended up with the TV in the house. And I would come home from school and watch TV. And I just regret the wasted years of my youth passively watching this material on TV. And it has been universalized and perfected. And you mention all the violence, Arnie. Well, this is an evolution that has been planned. It is a desensitization of the population so that what they would have found absolutely repulsive and unacceptable in the past, they now tolerate. I remember I saw a movie with just gore from people being shot, and I wanted to leave the theater with my brother because I couldn't stand it. Well, today I've seen so much gore that I don't have the same reaction. I've been desensitized, and I regret that I have lost that innocence. It's a terrible thing. Little kids are seeing people cleaved in two with swords at 9 o'clock at night. There was a series about the Vikings, and the violence was just unbelievable. You know, somebody would be cut in half and the whole screen would go red with blood. And this is what's being insinuated into the minds of little children. Also the language. I mean, there was a time when sailors swore, but in polite company, it wasn't regarded as a normal thing. But you go to a movie nowadays and every third word is the F word. Well, this is just another desensitization and a primitivization of the mind of the members of society. It's not accidental. This sort of thing has been brought along slowly, and in every entertainment production now, there are politically correct ideas that are insinuated. If they're not the main theme, there's not one item that has particularly public support that doesn't have this element in it. So unless people realize that there's a constant attempt to control the way they think and to direct their minds in ways that will ultimately atomize society and lead to society being just contending and eventually warring groups, we're in for a very rough ride. Fortunately, I think that this COVID business could have the effect of undermining people's confidence in at least the information media to such an extent that a lot will be brought out of their hypnotic state.
Thank you for that, Robert. A very good and lucid summary. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, that is certainly true. We've been conditioned. It's not an accident. It is part of the official literature of the communist movement. It is something that has been employed to one degree or another, whatever conscious level, by tyrants throughout history. You have to get compliance of the population, and that requires deception. It does not involve objective and honest communication. You want them to be compliant, so you have to condition them to be compliant. And it is a testament to the tragedy of humanity that we have been subject to and influenced by this type of strategy. It's really a disgrace, and it's a tragedy. So, we've got to release ourselves from this. We've got to rebel psychologically, philosophically. We've got to say this is not what we observe to be reality, what you're trying to impose upon us or impart to our minds. This is not reality, because we can see that there is abundance in the natural world, and there's potential for even greater abundance. We don't have to be told that we have to pull in our belts while at the same time we're sent off to war to destroy nations. This is again an aspect of the insanity. And it's a problem with the conservatives. Say the left is inclined to be influenced by Karl Marx and his colleagues. They believe that labor is the source of all wealth. And a lot of conservatives, probably most conservatives, actually, if they stopped to think about it and had to expound on this subject, they might be forced through their own mental processes to admitting that it's not true, and then being forced into the position, being in a corner. Well, what do we do about it? Because we can't just ignore it. You can't operate your economy without production. And as we said, increasing production in order to pay for previous costs. You see, the costs of production are not liquidated at the rate of production as they should be. And so we have this problem, and it's a form of Puritanism. It's the puritanical, domineering mind. The mind that is always moralizing, largely about things they don't understand. In other words, it's the Achilles heel of the conservative movement. And this has been gradually destroying the free society. These people know what they're doing, and they're very patient. They're not unaware of what's happening. And that is how they have demonstrated that, is how they seem to have come to a new consciousness or awareness of the way the banking system can and does create money in the form of credit. You see, now they've created this crisis, And they're using bountiful amounts of credit in order to subsidize consumption through debt. But that is not really subsidizing consumption. If it's repayable, in other words, debt, then it obviously is not subsidizing lower prices. It is merely adding to them. They're going to have to be paid in the future. So we're not going to be let off the treadmill. We're going to be kept on the treadmill. And the treadmill is going to be accelerated continuously as we fall more and more into the tyranny of debt.
Thank you for that, Wally. That's very well put. I'm going to just cut across to our website and just highlight a couple of things I think are most important. The first is that on our front page we've got the On Target, which is a weekly journal which we produce, and I would recommend that our viewers actually subscribe to On Target and receive it every week in the post. I think it really is important. There's so much work goes into it. These forums lead into the On Target, so it's an accumulation of our thinking and for the week. And also I'd point out that in the Social Credit Library we've got this bloke called Butler here, and Butler has written a booklet, 80-page booklet, 84 pages, an introduction course on the real communist conspiracy. It's very important that you actually prepare your mind for these things, that you actually resource your thinking so that you can actually analyze and discern what is actually taking place. It's not that easy. And like any sort of person who wants to be good at something, would you say 10 hours will do the job or 100 hours? Olympic standard is 10,000 hours to achieve that sort of resolve, that sort of understanding. And the fact is 10,000 hours, 4 years full time, 40 hours a week, 5 years, whatever. That's what it's like. And that's the sort of effort you've got to make if you're going to understand, you're going to work this through, come to conclusion and see a way through this mess that we're in, this civilization, as we're watching it crumble around us. There are answers. It's not easy. It takes effort. But as Solzhenitsyn highlighted many times, this sort of spiritual energy to actually pursue truth and to, if you like, regenerate society is fundamental if we're going to fix what's going on, if we're going to come out of this at the end and have something worth holding on to, something we call freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of action. Go where you choose to go. The police are there as a service. They are part of the community. They're not to be these Stasis with the guns at the ready to hold you to account. Get your mask on. What are you doing? Where are you going? This is Soviet systems. It's not the free world. It's certainly not English. It's not Christian. And we all need to take these into account. Do the reset. The reset, the greatest reset of all, is in our minds. This is the freedom of the mind to actually think this through and work it through based on history. Thank you so much, Wallace and Robert, for today's forum. It's been beaut. I always enjoy your company.
Thank you, Arnie. The feeling is mutual.
All right. Cheers.